The year was 1884, a summer so fierce the air itself shimmered like molten glass above the hard-packed earth. May Lynn stood in the clerk's office, the air stagnant and smelling of stale tobacco and dust. The man behind the counter looked at her with a mixture of pity and skepticism as he slid the deed across the rough-hewn oak. $20. That was the price for the Hollow Creek Ranch. It was a sum that whispered of tragedy, of land so cursed or barren that no cattleman in the territory would touch it. But May Lynn did not care about curses. She laid her coins down with a steady hand, her fingers slender but calloused from years of laundering other people's linens. She was 29 years old, wearing a light blue prairie dress that had once been the color of a summer sky, but was now faded by the relentless sun. She had bought freedom, or at least the illusion of it. The ride out to the property took the better part of the day, her rented wagon creaking under the weight of her meager belongings, a sack of flour, a crate of seedlings, and a heart full of cautious hope. The ranch was a skeleton of a place. The main house leaned wearily against the wind, its whitewash peeled away to reveal gray, sun-bleached timber. Weeds choked the porch, and the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic rasp of cicadas hidden in the dry grass. It was a lonely place, a place where a person could disappear, which was exactly what she needed. After unhitching the mule, she turned her attention to the barn. It was a massive structure, shadowy and foreboding, its double doors hanging slightly askew. She pushed one open, the rusted hinges screaming in protest, sending a flock of pigeons erupting into the twilight. Sunlight sliced through the gaps in the roof, illuminating floating motes of dust, and something else. A shape in the far corner, huddled beneath a moth-eaten horse blanket. The smell hit her then, not just the scent of old hay and manure, but the metallic, coppery tang of dried blood. May Lynn froze, her hand instinctively going to her throat where her pulse hammered like a trapped bird. Logic told her to run, to scramble back to the wagon and flee back to the safety of the town that didn't want her. But May Lynn had run enough in her life. She took a step forward, the dry straw crunching beneath her boots. The shape groaned, a low, guttural sound of agony that was more animal than human. She moved closer, the light formed the doorway, catching the dull gleam of a revolver lying just inches from the man's limp hand. He was sprawled in the dirt, a man built of grit and sinew, wearing the dust-coated remnants of a duster coat. His face was turned away, hidden by the shadow of a hat that had seen better decades, but the dark stain spreading across his side told the whole story. He had been shot, likely days ago, and had crawled in here to die like a wounded wolf. May Lynn looked at the gun, then at the man. She could leave him. If he died, no one would blame her. The territory was unforgiving, and death was just another neighbor. But she saw the way his hand twitched in his sleep, a reflex of survival even in the depths of unconsciousness. She sighed, a soft exhale that seemed to seal her fate, and knelt beside him. She moved the gun first, sliding it across the floorboards to the other side of the barn, out of his reach. Then she went to the well outside. The bucket came up heavy and cool. When she returned, she knelt by his side and soaked a rag. As the cool water touched his forehead, his eyes snapped open. They were gray, sharp, and instantly lucid despite the fever. He gasped, his body tensing to spring, his hand grasping for the weapon that wasn't there. When he realized it was gone, his gaze locked onto hers, terrifying and intense. He didn't speak, didn't ask for mercy. He just watched her, assessing the threat. May Lynn didn't flinch, though every instinct screamed at her to recoil. She simply dipped the rag again and pressed it to his neck. "Steady," she whispered, the word feeling strange in the silence. "I am not the one who shot you." The days that followed were a blur of heat and labor, a slow-motion dance between a woman determined to build a home and a man determined not to die in it. His name, she learned later, was Cole. He gave it up grudgingly, like a man handing over his last coin. He was a difficult patient, silent and brooding, his eyes tracking her every movement as she swept the barn and tended to his wound. The bullet had passed through, missing the vitals but leaving a mess of torn muscle that required constant cleaning. Mei Lin worked with a stoicism that matched his own. She boiled water, tore strips from her petticoats for bandages, and forced broth down his throat when he was too weak to lift the spoon. There was no gratitude in his eyes initially, only a hard, calculated suspicion. He was a man accustomed to betrayal, a gunslinger who had likely seen the worst of humanity and expected nothing less from her. Yet he never threatened her. Once the fever broke, the dynamic shifted. He began to watch her not as a threat, but with a confused curiosity. He saw her struggle with the heavy barn doors, saw her hauling water bucket by bucket to the scorched garden patch she was trying to coax to life. One afternoon, the heat wave reached its peak, the air turning into a suffocating blanket of yellow dust. Mei Lin sat on an overturned crate near him, wiping sweat from her brow, her blue dress dark with perspiration. She looked exhausted, her resilience fraying at the edges. Cole shifted, gritting his teeth against the pain as he propped himself up on one elbow. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together, unused for too long. "You bought this place," he stated, not a question but a realization. Mei Lin looked up, startled by his voice. "I did," she replied softly. $20. Cole let out a short, dry huff that might have been a laugh. "They robbed you," he rasped. "Land's dry as a bone. Only things that grow here are trouble and graves." Mei Lin straightened her back, her eyes flashing with a sudden fire. "Then I will plant something else," she said firmly. "I will plant a life." Cole stared at her for a long moment, the gray of his eyes softening just a fraction, realizing that the woman in the blue dress possessed a steel that rivaled his own. By the second week, Cole was on his feet. He was unsteady, leaning heavily against the barn walls, but the color had returned to his face. The domesticity that settled over the ranch was tentative, fragile as a spider web. Mei Lin did not ask him to leave, and he did not offer to go. It was an unspoken agreement born of necessity. She needed protection in this lawless expanse, and he needed a place to mend where his enemies wouldn't look. The transition from invalid to partner happened over the repair of the main house's front door. Mei Lin had been struggling to lift the heavy oak slab back onto its hinges, her arms trembling under the weight. A shadow fell over her. Cole stood there, looking pale but resolute. Without a word, he stepped in, his hands, large, scarred, and surprisingly gentle, taking the weight from her. Together, they guided the door into place. He dropped the pin into the hinge and stepped back, breathing hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "Thank you," Mei Lin said, her gaze lingering on his face. He nodded, wiping his brow with his forearm. "Door needs a lock," was all he said. That evening she made a stew from the vegetables she had brought from town, and a rabbit he had managed to snare near the creek bed. They ate on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon and painting the sky in violent shades of indigo and violet. It was the first time they had shared a meal properly. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was companionable. Mei Lin noticed how he ate, methodically, eyes scanning the horizon between bites. He was a creature of instinct, a protector by trade. "Who are you hiding from, Cole?" she asked, the question hanging in the cooling air. He paused, the spoon halfway to his mouth. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the darkening ridgeline. "Past," he muttered. "It has a way of riding faster than you can." He looked at her then, and in the dim light the rugged lines of his face seemed less severe. "You got a past too, Mei Lin. I see it in the way you listen to the wind." Trust is built in the quiet moments, in the rhythm of chores shared, and the knowledge that another person is awake and watching the dark while you sleep. The ranch began to change. With Cole's help, the fences were mended, the rotted posts replaced with sturdy timber scavenged from the creek line. Maylin's garden, against all odds and Cole's pessimism, began to show green shoots, a defiant splash of life against the brown earth. They fell into a routine that felt deceptively like peace. He would be up before dawn, checking the perimeter, his retrieved revolver always at his hip, while she started the fire and prepared the coffee. The light blue of her dress was now stained with the honest dirt of their labor, but she wore it with a dignity that made it look like royal silk. One morning, as they stood by the corral watching the sunrise bleed gold across the plains, the distance between them seemed to vanish. Cole stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his arm. He wasn't a man who touched easily. His world had taught him that touch was usually a precursor to violence. But as he pointed out a hawk circling the thermal currents, his shoulder brushed hers. Neither moved away. It was a terrifying intimacy, more electric than a storm. "Wind's shifting," he said, his voice low, vibrating in his chest. "Rain might come." Maylin looked up at him, studying the profile of the man who had crashed into her life. "We need the rain," she said. But the wind brought something else that afternoon. Maylin was hanging laundry, the wet sheets snapping in the rising breeze, when she saw Cole freeze. He was chopping wood near the barn, the axe raised mid-swing, but he had gone statue still. She followed his gaze to the southern ridge. A tiny plume of dust was rising against the blue sky, miles away but approaching steadily. It wasn't the wind. It was riders. Cole lowered the axe slowly, his face hardening into that stone mask she had seen the first day. The peace was over. The past had caught up, and it was riding hard. "Go inside," he ordered, not looking at her, his hand drifting to his gun belt. "Bar the door, Maylin." The way he said her name, with a desperate sort of protectiveness, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the wind. The dust cloud solidified into shapes, 5 riders emerging from the shimmering heat haze like specters summoned by the devil himself. They rode with the arrogance of men who knew the law did not reach this far out into the scrubland, their horses kicking up grit that tasted of sulfur and bad intentions. Cole stood on the porch, his posture deceptive in its relaxation. To an untrained eye, he looked like a weary ranch hand taking a break. To Maylin, watching through the crack in the shuttered window, he looked like a coiled rattlesnake waiting for the boot to land. She had disobeyed him, of course. She hadn't barred the door. Instead, she had retrieved the double-barreled shotgun from the mantel, a relic left by the previous owner, heavy and smelling of rust, and loaded it with trembling hands. She would not hide in the dark while he bled for her land. The riders slowed as they reached the yard, the leader pulling his massive bay horse to a halt near the well. He was a man named Pike, a figure from Cole's past, wearing a vest of black leather that creaked as he shifted in the saddle. His face was a map of old violence, scarred and sun-beaten, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a hat stained with sweat. "You're a hard man to kill, Cole," Pike called out, his voice carrying easily over the buzzing of the cicadas. He didn't draw his weapon, not yet. He just rested his hands on the saddle horn, a predator savoring the trap. Cole didn't answer immediately. He spat into the dust, a gesture of supreme disrespect. "You're trespassing," Cole said finally, his voice flat and devoid of fear. "Turn around." Pike laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "We ain't here for the view. We're here for the bounty on your head. And seeing as this place," he swept a gloved hand toward the dilapidated house, "looks like it's barely standing, I reckon the lady inside won't mind if we burn it down to smoke you out." Inside the house, Maylin's grip tightened on the cold steel of the shotgun. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the electricity of the approaching storm. She watched Cole's hand hover millimeters from his hip. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, until the wind suddenly died, leaving the world in a terrifying, breathless vacuum. The first shot was not fired by Pike, but by the nervous young rider on his left, who mistook the sudden flash of lightning on the horizon for movement. The crack of the pistol shattered the afternoon, and the world exploded into chaos. Cole moved faster than thought, diving behind the water trough just as the wood of the porch railing disintegrated into splinters where he had been standing a heartbeat before. Bullets hammered the house, punching through the thin timber walls, sending jets of dust into the air. Maylin dropped to the floorboards, the roar of gunfire deafening, the smell of black powder instantly filling her nose, acrid and choking. She crawled toward the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a sledgehammer. Outside, Cole was pinned. He returned fire sparingly, each shot from his revolver finding a purpose. One rider's horse bucked, throwing its owner. Another man cried out, clutching his shoulder. But they had the numbers, and they were flanking him. Pike was shouting orders, his voice cutting through the din, directing his men to circle the barn. Maylin saw a man dismount and run toward the porch, a torch flaring in his hand. The threat of fire terrified her more than the bullets. This was her home. This was the only thing she owned. A cold, hard resolve settled over her, displacing the fear. She rose to her knees, leveled the heavy shotgun on the windowsill, and aimed not at the man, but at the ground in front of him. She pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised her shoulder instantly, the boom far louder than the pistols outside. The dirt erupted at the man's feet, a spray of gravel and noise that sent him scrambling back, dropping the torch. The sudden roar from the house momentarily stunned the attackers. "She's armed!" someone screamed. In that split second of confusion, Cole rose from behind the trough. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke, not with rain, but with a sudden violent wind that whipped the dust into a blinding frenzy. The visibility dropped to zero, the yard becoming a swirling vortex of brown grit and gray shadows. It was the cover Cole needed. He moved like a ghost through the haze, the gunfire becoming sporadic and confused as Pike's men fired at phantoms. Maylin couldn't see him anymore. She could only hear the shouts of men realizing they were no longer the hunters. "Where is he? Damn it, where is he?" Pike's voice was edged with panic now. A gunshot rang out, closer than the others, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the earth. Then another. The wind howled, rattling the window frames, mirroring the violence outside. Maylin reloaded the shotgun, her fingers clumsy but determined. She stayed at her post, a silent sentinel guarding the threshold. Suddenly the front door burst open. She spun around, raising the weapon, but it was Cole. He stumbled inside, his duster coat torn, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead that blinded his left eye. He slammed the door shut and slid the lock home, pressing his back against the wood, chest heaving. "Stay down," he rasped, wiping the blood from his eye. "It's not done." But the silence that followed was heavy and final. The wind died down as quickly as it had risen, leaving only the sound of a lone horse galloping away in panic, likely the last survivor deciding the bounty wasn't worth the ghost in the barn. Cole listened, head cocked, his breathing slowing. He looked at Maylin, really looked at her, seeing the shotgun in her hands and the fierce set of her jaw. The room was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through the bullet holes in the walls. "You missed," he said, pointing to the porch. Maylin lowered the gun, her arms trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. "I wasn't aiming to kill," she whispered. "I was aiming to stop him." Cole let out a long breath, and for the first time a genuine smile touched his lips, grim but approving. "You stopped him all right." The aftermath of violence is always quieter than one expects. It is a silence that rings in the ears, a void where the noise of survival used to be. They waited an hour before venturing out, the sun beginning to set in a bruised sky of purple and blood orange. The yard was a wreck. The trough was shattered, water leaking into the thirsty dust, and the porch railing was gone. 2 bodies lay in the dirt, Pike and one of his men, looking small and insignificant in death. Mei Lin stood on the porch, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, the evening chill settling into her bones. She looked at the destruction, at the bullet holes in her home, but strangely, she felt no despair. The house still stood. She still stood. Cole was dragging the bodies away, toward the ravine where the coyotes would take care of the rest. It was a grim task, but necessary. When he returned, he went to the well and drew a bucket of water, washing the gunpowder and blood from his hands and face. He moved slower now, the adrenaline crash leaving him gray-faced and weary. Mei Lin walked down the steps and took the bucket from him. "Sit," she commanded gently. He obeyed, collapsing onto the edge of the porch. She took a clean cloth and began to tend to the cut on his forehead. It was deep, but it would heal. He hissed as the water touched the wound, but didn't pull away. His eyes were open, watching her face with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "They won't come back," he said quietly. "Pike was the money. Without him, the others won't risk it." Mei Lin nodded, her fingers brushing the rough stubble of his cheek. "And you?" she asked, the question hanging between them like smoke. "Will you go now? The danger is past." Cole caught her hand in his. His skin was rough, calloused, and warm. "The fence needs fixing again," he said, his voice low and rumbling. "And I reckon the roof took some damage." It was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. That evening the rain finally came. It started as a whisper against the roof, then grew into a steady, rhythmic drumming that washed the world clean. Inside the small kitchen, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. They sat at the small table, the lamp casting a golden circle of light that held the darkness at bay. They didn't speak much. There was no need for words. The bond between them had been forged in fire and tempered in blood. It was a solid thing, heavy and real. Mei Lin watched Cole as he sharpened his knife, the rhythmic shh, shh of the stones soothing her frayed nerves. He wasn't just a gunslinger anymore, and she wasn't just a laundress with a deed to a patch of dirt. They were survivors. They were a family, carved out of the wilderness by sheer will. Cole looked up, catching her gaze. The harsh lines of his face seemed to smooth out in the lamplight. "Mei Lin," he said, testing the name as if it were precious. "This is a good place." She smiled, and it was a smile that reached her eyes, erasing the years of hardship. "Yes," she agreed, listening to the rain feed the earth she had fought for. "It is home." They sat there as the storm raged outside, safe within the walls they had defended, 2 solitary souls who had found their anchor in the middle of nowhere. The ranch wasn't cursed. It had just been waiting for people strong enough to claim it. Thank you for listening to the story of the Hollow Creek Ranch. It is a tale that reminds us that redemption is not something we are given, but something we earn, through labor, through loyalty, and through the courage to stand our ground when the world demands we run. Mei Lin and Cole didn't just build a ranch. They built a legacy. Legend has it they stayed on that land for 40 years, turning the dust into a green oasis, their cattle growing fat on the grass that grew tall and sweet. They say if you ride out that way today, past the modern highways and the cell towers, you can still see the ruins of an old barn, its timbers silver with age. And if you listen closely to the wind whistling through the canyon, you might hear the echo of a hammer on wood, or the soft hum of a lullaby in a language half forgotten. It serves as a testament to the fact that love isn't always soft. Sometimes it is as hard as iron and as fierce as a summer storm. I hope this story reminds you that no matter how broken the past, the future is something you build with your own 2 hands. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright against the dark.